Hi, I'm Mark Clegg for the Photographer Academy, and today we're talking about the focal length and depth of field within an image and what's kind of right for you. I've got my two favourite zoom lenses. One is a 24-105 lens. This has a wide open aperture of f4, so it will allow the actual background to go out of focus if I'm using the f4. And I'm using a longer length of the lens like the 105. The other lens is the 70-200 lens, which has a wide open aperture of f2.8. So this will actually allow me one more stop of light than this lens does. Remember, the stops of light is all to do with the kind of the working triangle. So if I was photographing at 1 minute with this at say 200th of a second at 2.8 at 100 ISO, and then I would swap from this lens to this lens. This has one stop less of light, so this is an f4 lens, yes? So it means the quickest cheat for me to do is still stick to my shutter speed and my aperture, but in fact what I would then do is increase the working ISO, so from 100 to 200 would accommodate me kind of swapping this lens as such. I really want to talk about depth of field though, and I've kind of chosen f5.6 on all of these images. So the top left, the top right, the bottom left are all shot on the 24-105 lens. Why? Because the top left is 24mm, the top right is 50mm, and the bottom left is a 100mm. Whereas the bottom right hand side is 200mm, which is the maximum focal length of this lens as well. So in other words, with a 24-105 lens, I could shoot 3 images in the test, but in the bottom 2 images, I could shoot with the zoom lens, as I said, but as was, I only shot the 200mm with the actual zoom itself. We're looking at to see depth of focus. They're all shot on 5.6. They're all, I'm in a relative kind of position where I'm filling the frame with approximately the same amount of subject. This is my son. We're shooting in the back garden, decade ago, let's say, for a book that I was doing. That's where I've kind of gone back to the archive to get these images. And just in the top right hand corner of the right hand image, you'll see a white building there, and that was the studio in the gardens. Anyway, what we're looking at is the depth of focus, and we're looking at it through a tree. And we've chosen this tree here, which is visible in all of the photographs, as I'm kind of fixing my size of the subject based on the lens that I've got. So in other words, as I zoom in, I need to move the feet backwards to keep the kind of the figure the same size. But if we look, we can see what we've got. It's working on an aperture of 5.6, an average aperture. Remember, I prefer to use the likes of f2, 2.8 or below, or if I've kind of got my 24-105 on, I want to use f4. That's because I usually like the focus to drop in the backgrounds more. And what we've got here is this depth. Now, remember that when we're focusing in on somebody's face or body or shirt or whatever it would be, okay, I usually focus in on the eyes. As a rule then, that is the sharpest point of our image, yes? Everything else then is basically brought into focus or faked into focus, I like to say, by using either the wider angle lens combined with a bigger aperture. So in other words, likes of 11, 20, 16, 22 and so on with it. But realistically, whatever lens you shoot with, whatever aperture you shoot with, there's only really one spot on the photograph that is really pin sharp, and that is where you've taken it. Everything else is faked in that focus depth. So back to this tree, as we can see, as we change from the 24 zoom to the 50mm, we can see a dramatic change already here from basically a tree that looks sharp but isn't when we focus in on it. And now we can see that the tree in the background has totally blown out, and it gets more and more. So from the 50 mil, the 100 mil, the tree is almost becoming indistinguishable here. And the crushing of the perspective is bringing all the kind of the lawns behind, the bushes behind, crush into the depth and everything else with it. So it kind of starts to kind of merge together. And definitely by the time we get to the 200 mil lens here, we start to actually see the actual tree bark pretty much out of focus anyway. So when you're deciding on what lens you're going to use, you should think about really what am I trying to get in the perspective. So with Carl in the same kind of position and me filling the frame, like I said to you, to kind of simulate it on each one, you can see already in the top two images we've got the edges of the building just actually beginning to actually show in the right hand side of the photographs. By the time we zoom into the 100, the perspective is so tight that now it's obliterating over on the right hand side, so we can't see the studio wall at all. And then obviously by the time we get to the 200 mil, then pretty much we've focused in more. And I think that's why so many photographers like the 70-200 lens and shoot more on the 200 level, is because they like this crushing of the depth of field. Now remember, a prime lens will give you a slightly different result, or at times a dramatically different result, depending on kind of your subject and aperture and so on with it. But as far as the 24 mil, what I would implore you to do is just don't kind of shoot without consideration to composition. And don't kind of then just go in and crop things in the likes of Lightroom or Photoshop for the sake of it. Train your eye to actually identify what you want as a part of your photograph. So when I'm using a 24 mil, I'm thinking more it's an editorial image. When I'm shooting with a 50 mil, this is, you know, the standard lens on a kind of a full frame camera. A 50 mil is kind of this middle ground between editorial and portrait lens. When we get to beyond 85 to 100, we're then kind of in the portrait lens kind of era, as it were. So in that kind of the ballpark. And when we kind of move to the 200, we're into a true telephoto kind of distance image. And the only thing that you've got to do when you're shooting with a very long zoom is to make sure you're kind of raising your voice more towards your client, because they're going to have to hear you, because you're going to be kind of considerable distance away and things. So for me, 24 mil is great when I'm looking to show more of a scene in an editorial way. And obviously I would usually personally still use f4 with the lens that I have, but you might be limited on what your lens will do. With the 50 mil lens, if I was going to use that, in fact, I would usually shoot 2.8 or below. The 2.8 will pretty much guarantee me, no matter what lens I use, let's say, is that if I'm focusing on the eye, the tip of the nose is in focus, and the kind of the back or the front part of the ear is still in sharpness as well. Once you go opening up from 2.8 to f2, let's say, you start to actually have a very shallow depth of field, no matter what lens you use. But the longer the length of the lens, if you keep to the same aperture, as you can see on these four images, what you actually get is a crushing of the depth of field. And you can basically have an image pop out of the scene, just from use of the actual lens choice and the aperture choice as well. So 24 is editorial, 50 mil is more my kind of mid ground, 100 mil is the portrait lens, 200 mil is more of my fashion style of lifestyle image through choice. So get your lenses out, do a similar test yourself, and see what it kind of combines to give you the working kind of look and feel that you want to kind of progress your photography through.